So, I was talking about Richard Hofstadter's book, American Violence, A Documentary History, 1970. Note the date, 1970. So we saw in his anti-intellectualism in American life, we saw he was frankly traumatized by the election of Dwight David Eisenhower, which seems quaint to us today, right? I mean, here was this military general who was perceived as not being very bright, who defeated Adlai Stevenson, a man who was basically a scholar, an intellectual, a public intellectual. And Hofstadter and his other friends were really just couldn't figure that out. You may have similar feelings now, because an anti-intellectual was elected president. In terms of American violence, this is what he says. And again, I just want him to kind of introduce the topic. We're not going to spend too much time with him, just this one slide. But he has unique observations here. He says that when we talk about domestic violence, and he means violence in the nation as opposed to global violence, which would include what we understand as domestic violence. But he says when we have domestic violence with the kind of national power that the United States has had and still has, he's like, that generates global fear. And you know, hey Blake, and you know, that's a pretty powerful observation and kind of obvious, but I'd never thought of it before. Maybe you have, being from another country and looking upon America. It must be terrifying to see our internal violence, knowing the arsenal we have, and being on the outside of that. I thought that was a pretty amazing observation. Yeah, here's one of his opening lines. The United States, it has been said, has a history but not a tradition of domestic violence. Think about that. It has a history but not a tradition. A history because violence has been frequent, voluminous, almost commonplace in our past, but not precisely a tradition for two reasons. First, our violence lacks both an ideological and geographical center. It lacks cohesion. It has been too various, diffuse, and spontaneous to be forged into a single, sustained, inveterate hatred shared by entire social classes. Second, we have a remarkable lack of memory where violence is concerned, and have left most of our excesses a part of our buried history. Again, interesting. That goes to what our next lecture will be next week, The Innocent Nation. He says, again, Hofstadter, what is most exceptional about the Americans is not the voluminous record of their violence, but their extraordinary ability in the face of that record to persuade themselves that they are among the best behaved and best regulated of peoples. Well, you're probably already thinking that's a fairly common rhetoric of America, the nation. I don't know if you remember the Affordable Care Act. There's a lot of talk of, you know, we have the best healthcare system in the world. Why would we change it? Well, that's factually untrue. So we have the best X. Why would we, you know this rhetoric, right? And when in fact you can look this stuff up, it's not hard. Hey Lou, we are number one in military spending and the incarceration of African Americans, et cetera. So my point is not that to critique America in those terms. We can do that later if you want. But to point out Hofstadter's point is that our rhetoric is very different from our reality. Okay, so that's true of everybody in every country, but he's going to make the point that it's uniquely American. Not that other countries don't do it, but that we do it in a unique way. Yes? Yeah, I'm actually going to try to provide what he says we don't have tonight, and that's one of the reasons. So yes, racial violence seems to be a tradition. We might say it's a myth, right? It's a story we keep telling. So I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, we're going to end with about 5 myths of violence that I think counter this observation by Hofstadter. He also says that very little of national violence has been insurrectionary. Okay? I think that's right. He says, given the sheer size of the country, the mixed ethnic, religious, and racial composition of the people, and the diffuseness of power under our federal system have all tended to blunt or minimize citizen versus state conflicts and to throw citizen versus citizen conflicts into high relief. That sounds right, doesn't it? The closest we get to citizen versus state, I think, are the labor riots in the late 19th century. And maybe the civil rights movement, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to associate insurrection with a pacifist movement, in my mind. But, you know, if you're talking about resisting the state, those are the two examples I think of. Of course, the free speech movement and the anti-war movement, along with the civil rights movement. Hofstadter says that violence, state violence, has always been unilateral, so that it has been unleashed, I'm quoting him here, the state has unleashed violence against abolitionists, Catholics, radicals, workers, labor organizers, I'm quoting, Negroes, I'm quoting, Orientals, and other ethnic or racial or ideological minorities, and has been used ostensibly to protect the American, the Southern, the white Protestant, or simply, I would say not simply, but in a very complex way, the established middle-class way of life and moral. Let me give you a couple more quotations and we'll move on to a theory of violence, which I know is why you're here. D.H. Lawrence, you know D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Sons and Lovers, etc. The essential American soul is hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. Man could turn a phrase. And then this is Hofstadter kind of summing up his thoughts on American violence. I don't know, some 600 pages later. I love this. I think he just hits these nerves in American mythology, American culture that I think is why he's still popular. The nation, this is 1970, the nation seems to slouch onward into its uncertain future like some huge inarticulate beast, too much attainted by wounds and ailments to be robust, but too strong and resourceful to succumb. Ah, nice. All right, so I'm going to give you this theory of violence and the sacred, actually. So if this gets too weird, feel free to stop me. I can ditch it and we can talk about something else. But it is a theory of culture based on violence. Frenchman René Girard, 1972, his book Violence and the Sacred. So let me see if I can give you the gist with a quotation from Girard in one sentence here. And he's not talking about America, he's talking about all cultures. He's a structural anthropologist. If left unappeased, violence will accumulate. If left unappeased, violence will accumulate until it overflows its confines and floods the surrounding area. Thus, the role of sacrifice is to stem this rising tide of indiscriminate substitutions and redirect violence into its proper channels. I know, hang on. So he says that culture begins and is based on mimesis. That's just a fancy Greek word that means copying. So we like to imitate, right? So we like to imitate each other. So for example, Don Quixote, the great knight errant, wants to imitate, I forget the knight's name but it's in the novel. He wants to be that guy. Okay, well that's cool, that's fun. You know, it's external. It's in the imagination. Internal mediation is where we all exist in the same space and time with the same desires. we all want X. And you look like me, you have the same desires as me. We talked about this a little bit with capitalism. Therefore, you are a threat to me. That's true, right? I mean, if there are limited resources and more of us than the resources available, and you look like someone who wants the same resource I do, you're a potential enemy. All right? And he even says sometimes we have this metaphysical desire where we want to become the other person. And we wouldn't know anything about that here in Los Angeles in celebrity culture. But yeah. Mimetic desire, the desire to imitate others for the same resources generates rivalry. Okay, listen to it. Religion, in its broadest sense, then, must be another term for that obscurity that surrounds our efforts, that surrounds man's efforts to defend himself by curative or preventative means against his own violence. We know this, right? We know this deep in the limbic brain, that we all could become violent in this room given the right circumstances. That's what he's talking about. And the right circumstances have been layered over in 2017 in America, but they're there. All right, it is that enigmatic quality that pervades the judicial system when that system replaces sacrifice. So he's saying the judicial system, the rule of law, is actually the topmost layer, but underneath that layer is sacrifice. If you don't think that's true, look at the death penalty. This obscurity coincides with the transcendental effectiveness of a violence that is holy, legal, and legitimate, successfully opposed to a violence that is unjust, illegal, and illegitimate. So he's saying we have this violence. Anytime we gather as a social group, there's violence because we're violent. And we know it, and we compete for resources and other things, all kinds of other things. Attention, for example, the other sex, all that. There's all kinds of competitiveness built in, Girard says. We must find a way to discharge that, right? Because otherwise, it's going to be random violence. And we hate that more than anything because you can't predict it, right? But if you set up a ritual, Girard says, then you can discharge it this way. What does that mean? The scapegoat, right? This is the ancient Hebrew ritual. It inaugurated Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, right? So it's a little different now, of course, but when it was originally created, it involved the priest, the high priest in ancient Hebrew culture, would symbolically take the sins of the people, including his own sins, put them on this goat, and send the goat away to Azazel, the demon in the wilderness. And you do this once a year. That's not bad, right? You're going to get forgiven once a year. More than that, you're going to take the whole community's sins and erase them. Now, it's not good to be a goat in this scenario, but still, there must be a victim. And the victim must be arbitrary. So ritualized violence solves the problem of mimetic violence. This is also very Freudian, if you haven't picked up on that yet. It's about cathexis and discharging something into a projected meaning. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. Girard says the scapegoat mechanism, where you discharge the community or the social group sins into an arbitrary victim, is the mechanism. That mechanism is the foundation of culture and civilization. I know he's a French philosopher, so he gets to make these wild claims. But it's kind of interesting if you think about it. Because if you approach culture as a rational set of discourses and, okay, you can do stuff like that, but what are you going to do with the violence? What are you going to do with the visceral human, right? Who wants, the id, right? What are you going to do with that? Well, Girard goes there. He goes to the most basic, horrific element of our lives, our willingness and ability to do violence to one another. And he says that's the basis of culture and civilization, because you're trying to take care of the problem. Okay? You're trying to take care of this violence problem because you know, left to its own devices, we're going to be the opening of 2001 Space Odyssey. Right? We're just going to be beating each other with clubs. So, culture, civilization. The surrogate victim is the key. Listen to what he says. To understand how and why sacrifice functions as it does, we should consider the proposition that the ritual victim is never substituted for some particular member of the community. We're not going to do this because Satinder messed up, right? Because that just perpetuates the violence. It just gives it a more formal structure. It has to be arbitrary. Or even the community as a whole. It can't be, hey, we all deserve violence. Because then, again, okay, well, let's break out the violence then if we deserve it. It's got to be outside the system. You've got to make this symbol outside and unrelated so that you can project it onto this poor goat, right? The victim itself serves as a substitute for all the members of the community. Not a symbol, a substitute. The sacrificial substitution does indeed play the role that we have attributed to it, protecting all members of the community from their respective violence, but always through the intermediary of the surrogate victim. Girard says this is also the foundation of religion. Because think of that. Think of being in a primal society where there's no what we would call civilization or culture. You live in fear of violence all the time. But now you've developed this ritual, the scapegoat mechanism. Think of how that must feel when you literally and symbolically, I guess symbolically is the better word, take the violence that's brewing, ready to explode in your community, and you put it outside the community. It's the birth of religion, Girard says. He says that peace that comes from that is the beginning of religion. I buy that. I think that's a pretty good argument, because what happens is the victim now becomes sacred. That image was not chosen by accident. The surrogate goes from monster to God, right? He goes from bearing all sins to being sinless. Why? Because of what it does. I mean, you can just talk about this in terms of social functions. It relieves the community of its burden of violence and gives it peace. We saw this in our Gods and Monsters course with Tiamat, the original goddess who has to die and becomes cut up and becomes the ocean. We saw that in Greece, in Uranos, who dies and gets, a creator god who dies and gets cut up to become the universe. Of course, we see it in Christianity, which has an act of violence at its very center. A gruesome act of violence. Not just, I mean, this is, you see the image and you know the story. It's sacrifice. It's not murder, it's sacrifice, yeah. Religion, study the theory of religion. It's hard to get away from the notion that it involves either functionally or ontologically, that is, by its very nature, social integration and coherence. Because if religion doesn't do that, why have it? This is, frankly, this is Daesh, or sometimes known as ISIL or ISIS. This is their problem. I hope you're not here tonight. But you cannot sustain that, right? Because you are not humanizing, your religion is not humanizing the violence. You're just violent, gratuitously violent. Yeah. So that excellent point. Girard would agree with you and say what went wrong is that you lost the arbitrariness of the victim. And so this is why it's not working. So yes, we have a death penalty. It looks a lot like sacrifice to me. I'm a religious studies scholar. I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that is. We're sacrificing people. But Girard says that's why it doesn't work, is because you're punishing people for their sins. And the victim must be arbitrary because it has to go outside the system. You're punishing people within the system. You're perpetuating the violent mechanism. That's hard to argue with, is that as culture develops, you keep layering things on. For example, we can't see this mechanism work, he says. Because if we see it, we'll be horrified by it, and it won't work anymore. It has to be in the unconscious. It has to be in the cultural unconscious. And you know this. We've been talking about this all along, how these stories, where these myths, they have to kind of be in the unconscious. In Western culture, they have to. Because I don't want to get into it, but I can talk about it later if you want. We have to push them down or back. Yeah. Well, Girard is a philosopher. He's not that interested in how to achieve growth. He's just interested in describing, not prescribing. So, but your question still stands. How do we achieve growth? If Girard were here, he would say that we're having this conversation right now and not killing each other or attempting to is growth. So it's a pretty low bar. But I think you're talking about spiritual growth too, right? Yeah, yeah. And in fact, Girard says this is about myth. He says when it becomes mythological and as culture develops, the victim isn't drowned, for example. She goes to live in the sea, right? So, and that's good. I mean, that's evolving, right? But it's also hiding the scapegoat mechanism, which you have to do. Right? So this is, Girard in a way is psychoanalyzing culture. Well, okay, you are going to be difficult tonight. Theories like this are non-falsifiable. They're not scientific theories. They're more like stories. And you're asked to think about this story. So, no, there's no evidence. I mean, there's the evidence that he adduces. Well, yeah, he actually has a pretty good argument in the whole book. So, for example, he says the oldest form of literature is tragedy. Why? Because this is the oldest form of culture that involves a tragedy. An innocent victim. Yeah. And he has a whole section on Oedipus that I did not inflict upon you. But, you know, Oedipus, who was cursed to kill his father and marry his mother and did everything he could to avoid that, and it ended up happening anyway. So he says, I'm almost finished, and then with Girard, and then we'll get to America. He says the scapegoat mechanism, like something in the unconscious, comes out, you know, because you can't keep the unconscious repressed. It comes out. And so it comes out in things like the witch trials or crime narratives or the television series Law and Order, right? Because it's order, right? Based on the law, which is ultimately based on the scapegoat mechanism. Because somebody always goes to jail, right? Dun, dun. So, yeah, I'm not going to read you about the crisis of differences, but because that gets into semiotic theory, and I think you've been patient enough. But let me read you Girard's conclusion. All religious rituals spring from the surrogate victim. The surrogate victim. Not somebody within the community, but who is being punished for that, but arbitrary victims. And all the great institutions of mankind, both secular and religious, spring from that ritual. Now, this is a very French way to do this, to say all this comes. But again, evaluate the argument and the story. Such is the case, as we have seen, with political power, legal institutions, medicine, the theater, philosophy, and anthropology itself. It could hardly be otherwise for the working basis of human thought. The process of symbolization is rooted in the surrogate victim. Even if no example taken alone offers conclusive proof of my theory, their cumulative effect is overwhelming. And that's why you have to read the whole book. All the more so because they coincide with archetypal myths that tell in apparently naive fashion how all man's religious, familial, economic, and social institutions grew out of the body, Tiamat, Uranus, of the original victim. The surrogate victim, as the founder of the rite, appears as the ideal educator of humanity, in the etymological sense of educatio, a leading out. The rite gradually leads men away from the sacred. It permits them to escape their own violence and removes them from violence and bestows them all the institutions and beliefs that define their humanity. I found this article that was really interesting about, I thought I wrote it down here. Yeah, John G. Gowelty, Violence in American Popular Culture. Really interesting analysis, just a little journal article. He says there are 5 myths of violence. So the reason I had this slide up, I'm going to come back to it later, is that one of the great books on American history is by Richard Slotkin, and it's called Regeneration Through Violence. And it's the story of America from 1600 to 1860. And his argument is that if you read the literature of the period, the literature, because that is the form that is most close to myth, story, right? He says what you see is, well, I'm actually going to talk about what you see. So I'm going to come back to Slotkin here in a minute. The other guy, Gowelty, says he sees 5 myths of violence in American popular culture. This is mostly film, of course. And of course, these are not hard and fast categories. These are just kind of movements or threads, so they're going to overlap and all that. But it's kind of interesting what he does here. The crime does not pay myth, the vigilante myth, the equality through violence myth, the hero and his code myth, and regeneration through violence, Slotkin. Okay? So let's go over them briefly, and then you can have at it. Crime does not pay. This is the old lex talionis. The Code of Hammurabi, the first kind of legal statement that we have in ancient Mesopotamia, lex talionis, an eye for an eye. The Bible picks up on this, right? So the hero here is acting on the moral and poetic equivalence between the criminal act and the hero's vengeance. So you did this, then I'm going to have to do that, right? Lex talionis, an eye for an eye. It's a primitive kind of justice. We find this in superheroes, especially like Superman. Not all superheroes, because superheroes have gotten really dark lately. So I chose Superman on purpose. He's just balancing things out, right? He doesn't even want to do this. He'd rather be a newspaper reporter. But he's got to do this, because you got to balance things out. I'll let you psychoanalyze that. The vigilante, Death Wish, Charles Bronson, right? This is really interesting because this is a story about the societal problem, the weaknesses of society. So the hero is reluctant. He doesn't want to do this. He really doesn't want to do this, but he must do this because violence has struck close to him, right? Classic Death Wish, the classic every vigilante movie. It struck close, a family member, usually a wife, maybe a daughter, and the system doesn't work for him. So he must take things into his own hands, the vigilante. There's a gradual process of escalation, right? He tries to not do this, but then he keeps getting pushed, right? You know this story. We see this story all the time. There's actually a historical background to this because there were vigilantes, like the Klan, somebody mentioned that earlier, that dispensed their own justice, especially in late 19th, early 20th century. But this has been transformed into a single individual. John McCain and Die Hard, etc. This is what Coltelli says. This is perhaps the ultimate fantasy embodied in the myth of the vigilante, the use of individually controlled violence to create the ideal suburb. In such an expression, the vigilante myth perhaps comes closer to reality than is entirely comfortable. for the unrestrained use of personal and community security forces has played a significant role in protecting the American upper classes in their walled-off estates and housing developments. Equality through violence. Equality through violence. So, sorry. Activating the American dream through violence. What's the story? That's going to be The Godfather, right? Right? You are... you are, for whatever reason, you are treated, you're marginalized for whatever reason, like your ethnicity or whatever, nationality. You must achieve equality, and you have other paths to choose, but you choose violence. So it's activating the American dream through violence, the early Don Corleone, right, who must fight his way to the American dream, kill his way to the American dream. It's a violent variation on the Horatio Alger story, remember, the rags to riches story? It's a violent version of that. Raymond Chandler characters like Philip Marlowe there, yeah. Okay. Violence is the rule rather than the exception. This is your way in America. We know this one. The hero and his code, right? There's Jack Reacher. It is violence tempered by restraint. Oh, I am a badass, and I really don't want to kick your ass. Please don't make me kick your ass. But he ends up kicking people's asses, right? Because this is a version of the Western shootout. You know, there's a code there in the Western shootout where you, if you're the hero, you never draw first.
Anybody remember Roadhouse?
I didn't think of that. How perfect.
He didn't
want to fight. He's so pretty. He doesn't want to fight. He just wants to be there looking pretty. But you're going to make him fight, kick your ass. Here we go. Here, ritual is very important. It's important that you stick to the code. In fact, it's everything. The code is everything. So following the code is what leads you to violence. It's kind of an inversion of the other myth we just talked about, because your allegiance is to the code, not to advancement in society or retribution or whatever. So it's kind of Bushido in a way, some of this, like samurais, right? What's that? Oh, Bruce Lee, yeah, exactly. Exactly, the code matters more than anything. And the code will lead you to violence reluctantly because the world is the way it is. Right? But you stick to the code. By the way, the code is unwritten, because if it's written, then it becomes the law. And that's a whole different thing, right? A law is for other people. It's too low, right, on the honor code. So Raymond Chandler, right? Oh my God, listen to him. What a writer. This is from a little essay called The Simple Art of Murder, about writing. Do you know this? Oh my goodness. Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. The detective in this kind of story must be such a man. He is the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be, to use a rather weathered phrase, a man of honor. By instinct, by inevitability, without thought of it, and certainly without saying it. He must be the best man in his world, and a good enough man for any world. I do not care much about his private life. He is neither a eunuch nor a satyr. This is how they used to write. It was good. I think he might seduce a duchess, and I'm quite sure he would not spoil a virgin. Okay, so that's not. Okay. Man of honor in one thing, he is that in all things. He is a relatively poor man, or he would not be a detective at all. He is a common man, or he would not go among common people. He has a sense of character, or he would not know his job. He will take no man's money dishonestly and no man's insolence without due and dispassionate revenge. He is a lonely man, and his pride is that you will treat him as a proud man or be very sorry you ever saw him. Damn, that's good writing, most of it. So, regeneration through violence. I mentioned this earlier, Richard Slotkin's Slotkin's another one of those Hofstadter guys who's like written these enormous books about American history that are incredible, but it's real work to get through them. 1973, he sees America as anti-mythological in the sense that, let's see, do I have a quote here? Simply in the sense we've been talking about it. We don't like to call them myths. We don't like our myths out in the open. They function better in the unconscious. That's all he means. Oh, there it is. Myths work in the unconscious, personal, and cultural. So American mythology is unofficial, and myths affect us. Okay, you knew all that. Here's the regeneration through violence myth, and I'm almost done. This is Slotkin, purification and regeneration. Okay, now we're talking Girard, right? We're talking a national scapegoat mechanism. Who do you think the scapegoats are going to be? Again, because we get it wrong, it's not arbitrary victims, it's pointed victims. So this is a national sacrifice, and he says there are two kinds of myths, two kinds of stories that work within this myth. One is the captivity narrative. I don't know if you know this, but there's a whole genre of stories from the early 19th century, about and late 18th century about Indians, and I'm using the language of the captivity narrative. Indians capturing white women. You know this. Mary Rowlandson was a famous one. I don't know. Anyway. Slotkin says this, the violence in this myth is related to the settlers' imaginative tendency to project onto the Indians their own latent desires for freedom, sensuality, and escape from the spiritual rigors of the Christian community. Thus, the myth of the captive, the ultimate rescue and destruction of the Indians are also symbolically a destruction of the captive's own feared desires for lawlessness and lascivious freedom of the wilderness. We talked about that some in The Religious Nation, how the wilderness represented not just blank space, but the devil for the Puritans. Yes?
Well, I just wanted to contrast what we're talking about. Several writers who were on that.
Yes.
When the West was being opening up.
That's right.
Going to Utah and most of the Midwest and encountering, again, Native American or Native culture and the way they dress, obviously, which was for the environment, and seeing naked. I'm trying to remember the name of the writer, a female writer also, who expressed a lot of information in that. And I find it where there was a lot of blowback at the time about talking about the nobility of some of the Indians.
Are you talking about Helen Hunt Jackson?
Is it Helen Hunt?
I don't know.
This is the savagery
Yeah.
of which was mostly written about.
Yeah.
At the time.
Sure. Yeah.
But they were selling a lot of those kind of like cereals, they call them.
Yeah.
In the 1800s, 1880s, 1880s.
Yeah.
Based on the idea of the savage,
That's right.
And the pioneering
Yeah.
Latin.
James Fenimore Cooper made a whole living out of that.
Yeah.
Others, and you become the other. That's the danger. Right. Okay. So, oh, that's a good one. Edgar Rice Burroughs, man. In some ways, Tarzan's the only story we need. But okay, let me do this final. So, the violent nation, based in sacrificial myth and ritual. Okay, regardless of whether you agree or not with Girard, there are elements of sacrifice here. Whether it works the way he says it, it's up to you. But I think he's right about a lot of things. Violence is about resolving the paradoxes between the religious nation and the native nation. Our very first lecture, right? That's where we learned the violence of, as a national myth and ritual, that and with slavery, right? So that's where we learned. Social function of symbolic violence. It has a function. It's atrocious. It's appalling to us. But it has a social function, and that's why it keeps happening. Regeneration through violence. There is something sacred about the violence. Again, no matter how much it abhors us, but it does solve certain problems, not only of society, but of the sacred. All right, have at it.